Hey guys, it's Mathel here once again, and today I want to talk a bit about buffs in general to the game and the passive tree, skill gems, certain uniques, and certain other things. Just in general, things that I feel kind of need to be ramped up a bit, or if you don't like the word buff, let's just say changes to certain things, and I'm going to go over what I think needs to happen or could happen, and these are a lot of these ideas just straight off the cuff, and I haven't given them too much thought, so I don't, take too much stock in them. But it's just a few ideas and thoughts that I've had while playing the past few years, and recently in particular. So right now, let's just start off with ascendancies and say, for the most part, ascendancies are fairly well balanced. There's a few rather strong ones, a few kind of weaker ones, but in general, I think one that really needs a buff is Scion. Scion's been made as kind of a unique one amongst all the others, and supposed to be what looks like one of the most interesting ones you can possibly take. Yet right now there's essentially no reason to be a Scion, besides potentially Essence Drain, and that's because it does have one of the strongest sub-ascendancies comparatively to the actual primary ascendancy that it's trying to mimic in Occultist, as well as having some good quality of life of Deadeye, which also has quite a few decent perks compared to its actual primary ascendancy. But the rest of them, there's most of them just suck. Most of them suck so bad that you can't possibly justify taking them in any build. Berserker was good, but it got nerfed from your 1% damage leached all the time to recently, and that doesn't help anyone. You need a reliable leech. So that made it kind of shit. And everything else just kind of needs probably number changes or actually more focus on what the primary ascendancy is doing and trying to get it closer to that. Inquisitor, for example, you can either have an Inquisitor, which is 100% Ellie pen or ignore all Ellie resistances, or you can take this one, which doesn't do anything for your Ellie resistances somehow. So that just makes no sense to me. There's a lot there that can change. I think it's a very interesting ascendancy, and I'd definitely like to play more of them. At the moment, for Atlas, I have not planned a single Scion because it just really isn't worth it compared to actual ascendancies, except for potentially Essence Drain. So I think that definitely needs some help. Aside from that, there's not too much else that I think needs changing. I do think Raider could use a slight help instead of 15% chance on to gain a frenzy on kill. You probably want like 10 or 15% chance to gain a frenzy on hit, because Raider's largest problem is sustaining frenzy charges. It becomes just half your life in boss fights. Sustaining frenzy charges is already kind of annoying in general, because you have to use frenzy, for example, and that just takes away from your boss damage, puts you in sort of danger as well. As a raider, you go for more and more frenzy charges because chances are you're building around them for the raider ascendancy. And that means you then have anywhere from 8 to 10 frenzies to stack up at the start of a fight or to keep going throughout a fight. And that really takes away from the momentum of actually killing a boss or fighting one, and that's really where I think Raider goes wrong right now, because everything else is quite nice, but just Frenzy Sustain, it doesn't really help you do that too much except for some Frenzy Duration, and that's just not good enough in my opinion to justify taking it over, let's say, a Pathfinder or a Deadeye. Pathfinder, yeah, I think we know doesn't really need too many buffs. I'd say Deadeye could use a few movement speed buffs. It's a pretty good ascendancy. It's got its niche as sort of a ranged thing, but I do think that some of the mini passives here could use like a 4 movement speed, something similar to the Raider ones. 4 movement speed here and there, something like that over here would go a long way, because as an archer you do want a lot of movement speed, and that's potentially why you'd be picking this instead, because it gives a bunch of movement speed. Everything else I think is fairly well balanced for ascendancies, and it doesn't really need too many changes. The only other thing I'd like to see, I think, is for Gladiator, not Champion, Gladiator, instead of one-hand specializations here, maybe just general attack speed, 5% attack speed, 5% attack speed, and over here, instead of those actual just plain attack speeds. So you can play a two-hand character as a bleed without feeling like you're wasting all these mini passives, because right now it kind of is pigeonholing you into being, two one-handers or a one-hander, and I don't really agree with that as far as how Ascendancies are pushing you towards playing a certain spec. I think there should be more flexibility there. And by all means there is, but, it just feels bad wasting this. Likewise with Slayer, I do think it could just use 5% increased attack speed and then 14% physical damage, or just increased damage, rather than two-hand weapons strictly, because once again, you do by all means want to build one-hand characters or dual-wield characters with Slayer, but you're wasting these passives and that feels bad. Next up, there's not too much for me to say about this, but passive tree changes, I do feel just a few little tweaks could be used here or there. If they have more sweeping passive tree changes to make in the future, like a Shadow or a Templar rework from the past, that'd be cool too, and by all means could be rather nice. But I think in general, just a few more life points on the right side of the tree, it wouldn't even be very hard or drastic, like these 5s to turn into 6s. I think they were nerfed at one point from 6s to 5s, and it just left all of us confused because we just lost a few points of life over here for no reason. Essentially, if everything on this side of the tree went up by 1 point, from a 5 to a 6 or from a 4 to a 5, then in total, like a typical ranger build that takes all the life nodes here would go from 150% to 170% life. Is that really overpowered? I don't think so. And everyone kind of wants that change because life definitely is hurting at the moment, and you struggle to pick a life-based character over a CI character or low life character if you have the choice and the budget to build both in current endgame. So just 1% increase on everything would be rather nice. Probably just on this side, because life over here is rather easy to get and you still do stack plenty. So I'd say probably just around this area. There's a few other changes I wouldn't mind seeing, like this area here. You basically never travel through here. It always just kind of feels bad. Maybe drop a point. This over here could probably use a buff or a rework on how you get to it, because it's so incredibly inefficient, and it's life, you want to take it, but you never do because it's extremely inefficient. Besides that, I don't think there's too much I'd like to say. This over here kind of sucks. If it went up from 8 to 10 and from 16 to 20, I might take it in a lot of builds as I go by. I don't understand why these witch nodes are 3% cast speed. Compared to the Shadow's 4%. You barely take these ever anyway, so would this going up to 4 really be a bad thing? I don't think so. These maybe up another point or two. You rarely, if ever, travel through them. Just little buffs and little changes to normalize the tree. This one, melee damage, I don't really like that. I think that could be attack damage instead, because there's a lot of builds these days you want to play and they don't take advantage of this, but you're an attack-based build as a Templar, and it feels kind of bad just being horribly inefficient, let's say. I think that's all I want to mention for passive tree changes, and most of us can agree just a few extra points of life or a slight life buff in this general direction. Next up, I would like to tackle skill gems, and this one may be a bit lengthy since I will mostly go over pretty much anything I think needs a slight adjustment and just adjust it slightly as I see fit. So without further ado, I'll start with Bear Trap. Probably needs some sort of splash to make it actually usable, because none of us really use it anymore. It's just too slow in today's game. Blast Rain I think could fall a little bit faster to make it just a bit nicer to use. Blink Arrow, I think it's about time that turns into Blink Projectile so that Wanders can use it as well as bow users, because Blink Arrow is really good and I really like it and the way it fits into bow builds, but I think Wanders could really use something exactly like it, and I don't see why that can't just be reworked to Blink Projectile, something like that. Everything here is fine. Cyclone kinda got gutted. Would not mind seeing some of that reverted, like the first hit deals 50% less damage, maybe take it down to 30%, 20%. I don't know. It typically feels pretty bad to use right now. I know people just still do use it and can use it plenty, but it went from being a tier 1 melee skill to kind of a tier 2, and much less desirable to use because it's a lot harder to scale since you need a lot more damage to overcome this bullshit. Next up is, well, these we'll talk about for melee splash, I think. Elemental hit, I'm not sure I see a purpose for it in the game at this current moment. It's kind of just too bad. It needs bigger numbers, I'd say, for it to actually work properly. Ideally, I would have thought it just needed to be what Wild Strike essentially is. Instead of introducing Wild Strike, rework Elemental Hit to be something like that. Otherwise, maybe not even bigger numbers, just attach some penetrations. So instead of 10% chance to freeze, shock, and ignite, give it like 15% elemental penetration, for example. That might make it very usable, actually. Explosive arrow is fine. EK, I think that could use a bit more projectile speed at its base. I don't know. It just feels, I recently tried it, it feels kind of bad to use compared to Blade Vortex and Blade Fall, because they're the new level of skill out there. They're bigger, faster, and sort of hit harder overall than EK in my personal opinion. Just kind of feels wrong to use these days. I don't know what it needs anymore. Fire Trap, maybe a bit more area I think. Flicker's fine, don't even care about that. Frenzy, what about Frenzy? I think this needs a reduction in mana cost, maybe. Just a bit. That's a bit steep, considering you stack frenzies and attack speed. It gets faster and faster, and that becomes really hard to sustain. Otherwise, I think that's fine. Maybe a slight damage buff, I don't know. Maybe instead of physical, be just attack-based damage as instead, and then it could see some use in single target setups. I'm not quite sure, I haven't played around Frenzy recently. Most of these are all pretty fine, pretty good, I'd say. Lightning Strike obviously needs better collisions, and the way it travels over, you know, ledges, pillars, whatever, it just feels really bad to use in today's environment, especially with all the new maps and atlases. I could not ever see myself playing this over a Spectral Throw character. I'll probably try it again in the future, and then hate myself halfway through a map and put Spectral Throw in instead. So I think that's long overdue for a bit of a update in terms of its travel. Everything else I think over here is perfectly fine. Puncture, slight increase in damage most likely. You rarely use it these days. Over just plain stacking bleed on normal skills and scaling that better. So I don't know about puncture anymore. Maybe it just doesn't need to exist anymore. Who knows? Rain of Arrows, I think it needs a bit more area from what I remember last trying it. Reeve's fine I think, but I could, for me personally, I think an extra 1 second on your stacks would be rather nice, because at right now it's just uncomfortable to play after a while, because it really promotes a playstyle of not being able to loot and continuously going forward and faster, and it just gets uncomfortable, personally. Shrapnel is just a leveling skill, and that's all it can be, I think. Siege Ballista is fine, I suppose, and everything else is more or less good. Now, I won't go through each individual one over here. In general, I'll say I'm not sure how the design of cold skills is currently in the minds of the devs, because they're really struggling, I think. Essentially, right now to build a cold skill, all you do is grab it, put a pyre on, convert everything to fire, or use Avatar of Fire, or some cold to fire, and turn into fire damage, because it's far superior to have big ignites as a secondary source of damage after your initial hit, because more or less, if you compare, let's just say, Fireball to an Arctic Breath, my Fireball hits and then probably does like another fucking 5 times more damage off of the ignite behind it. Arctic Breath just hits like the same level as Fireball does and does nothing behind that. Especially because a lot of the endgame bosses right now are immune to chill and immune to freeze. So where does that leave it? It's just kind of a decent clearing skill, but even then you'd really rather the ignites that come along with a Fireball or a Flame Blast and whatnot. I'm not sure what you could do to fix that, whether just make things less chill and freeze immune, or some sort of other residual damage like a Vortex has. Not quite sure. All I'll say is I think cold skills are struggling, and to that same extent, lightning skills too. Lightning skills right now with the high level of boss health just don't shock anything, so their perk really doesn't exist either as far as boss kills are concerned. Your Guardian fights, for example, even most tier 15 or so map bosses aren't going to be shocked by a really big storm call even, just because your shocks are based off of a percentage of the monster's health, and you're never going to be hitting it that hard, so you won't ever really be shocking it for any substantial period of time, which is why something like Vinctars is so goddamn strong, since it perma-shocks things that even your lightning skills cannot shock. As far as the strength skills go, mostly melee stuff. A few things do need buffs, and I'll just go over them real quick. Ancestral Protector I think is fine and fits its niche as it's supposed to. The problem is Ancestral Warchief is too good, so Protector never gets used. So that's kind of for a topic of discussion in the nerf category, I think. Cleave, I think, definitely needs still a bit of increased area. Every time I've tried to use it recently, especially low level, it feels awful just because you don't even know when it's hitting or what it's hitting. The area just feels so like small, maybe even inconsistent. Maybe a better graphic for the actual hit radius too. But I think it needs a slight AoE buff to be usable. The damage is fine otherwise. Earthquake, yeah, she's fine these days. I think a Ground Slam could probably use a bit more area to be competitive with Earthquake and your Ice Crash. It's still okay, but chances are you're almost never using it over Earthquake if you want the best of the best. Ice Crash I think could probably afford to lose its less attack speed multiplier at this stage, or at least from 20 down to 10. Because it feels kind of bad to use compared to your Earthquake. Maybe even a bit more area and a bit less graphics. Every time I've tried using Ice Crash recently with good enough area, it just creates a clusterfuck on the screen. You don't know what's going on anymore, and it just ruins your, well, playability of the build, personally. Especially for me as streaming, it really ruins the bitrate for the stream. Infernal Blow, I think that needs less name locking to actually be perfectly viable, because right now it's, yeah, you can't really afford to build a character and run up and Infernal Blow things in endgame maps. It just gets you killed against tough maps, and you just can't really play that. You have to build super defensively, and then you don't have amazing damage for it. And I did forget to talk about Wild Strike there in the same manner. Definitely needs to not be name locked anymore. That's probably the only thing that needs help there. Maybe a bit of increased area on all the skills associated with it. Molten Strike, I think the balls need to hit a bit faster, because it's just too slow in today's game. You know, you can't really afford to run up, throw your Molten Strikes, and then wait for the balls to land, because it just takes a bit too long. So I'd like them to be a bit faster on the landing. Otherwise, I think it more or less fits its purpose of a single target skill, and you can build around it for AoE, just not very comfortably compared to other skills. I think I missed Leap Slam. Leap Slam, I think, needs a bit of extra range. It did used to have better range, which got nerfed, and now it feels kind of average. Even with really good attack speed, it feels kind of average. I'd like better range on a Leap Slam, personally. And everything else, Static Strike, no name locking, please. Let us just like shift click it and charge it up kind of by itself. I think it kind of needs that at this point to be a viable skill. It's far too dangerous to use otherwise. And Sweep, maybe just a bit more area. Vigilant Strike, I don't know, that's probably never getting used anyway. As far as support gems go, not really sure I have too much to say here. One thing I did kind of want to say is the added cold, added lightning, and added fire support gems. I think if all three of those had like a 10% penetration mod on them, that would be pretty sweet and make them see more use. At this stage, added cold, added lightning, they have pretty niche uses, and right now you'd rather just the more multipliers, which there are plenty of at the moment, than using those. So I think it would also make you potentially move away from Inquisitor as much if, let's say, added cold damage support had all this damage, and then by, or even from level 1, had 10% cold penetration. or maybe even 15%, probably 10. Likewise with lightning, and probably with added fire as well. Also would help for your melee builds to actually have some useful elemental damage rather than most of the time just get it resisted and do almost nothing. I think the additional accuracy support probably could use some extra bit of crit chance tied to it. Not a base crit chance, but you know, like let's say 50 to 100% just normal crit chance. And then it might actually see some use, because right now it's kind of a dumb support, really. You try and build your character to never need accuracy, and that should be almost always the case. So it can only really exist, even in a juggernaut setup, it's more or less worse than a lot of other gems. So just give it a bit of crit chance, I think. Something like that. I don't have too much else to mention about most of these. Fork, I think, needs a less damage multiplier. Maybe start at 20% and then by level 20 have 0% less, because it punishes you pretty bad just for using it. Using something like a fork or a chain is already punishment in and of itself, because it's forcing you to sacrifice a damage slot. Like let's say you can no longer use faster attacks, meaning you're now losing 50% attack speed, and then you're also reducing your damage by 30% less. So it's a twofold system in bending you over for using it. So both chain and fork, I think, could probably use a bit of a less damage help. Don't know though. Chain's still more or less used, I think. But typically if you're going to chain with a build, you're probably just building a Deadeye these days. Everything else, yeah, more or less fine. Could use a few more interesting support gems rather than just more introductions of Moors. So even attaching more to Pierce didn't entirely make sense. I welcomed it and I've been using it, but it already had its perk there, and then it also gives you more damage, whereas the others that give you perks, your GMP, your chain, your fork, actually reduces your damage on top of that. I think life gain on hit is probably a gem that needs an update at this stage. 40 life gain on hit at level 20. Even with some of the fastest attacking builds, this really doesn't help much when you're going to get a 5,000 hit from a boss, you know? So that kind of might need to go up to like 100, something like that. As well as that, the melee damage on full life, kind of useless. Like, yes, there are certain situations you can use for it, like your CI characters, but I feel like that should, if it's for CI characters, then just make it a gem that says 50% more melee damage if you have full energy shield, or if you have energy shield, I don't know, whatever. But right now it just doesn't work, because pretty much every single melee character out there is going to be running Blood Rage. It's just worth it. And you can't ever be at 100% life with melee damage, with Blood Rage up. So you almost never get use out of this. So either the mechanics of Blood Rage need to change so you can actually be at 100% life while over leeching or over regenning, or I think, yeah, I don't know, maybe it needs to be just 99% plus life. Because right now you just can't use it, and it's kind of sad, because that is a nice gem we would like to use. Now, to go through every item and unique in the game right now would be just impossible, so I won't really talk too much about uniques. I think I more or less covered what I wanted to say about gems and ascendancies and passives. For the most part, uniques kinda serve their purpose at all levels. Some of them are pretty shit and might never see use, and they could use slight buffs to actually be usable while leveling. But for the most part, just about every unique out there can be used at some point while leveling some sort of build, so it has its purpose, and it also just fills out as crap that you don't want to find, which is taking up precious unique slots as intended, so we can't really be too sad about that. One thing I would like though is Malagaros to kind of be buffed up a bit to like 40-50 crit multi maybe, or Facebreakers nerfed so that I don't have to use them in every fucking character, because for some reason these are your top DPS gloves, since they didn't get nerfed on their crit multi when all the crit multi numbers got changed, while Malagaros did. So that made no sense to me. Apparently Malagaros were too good and Facebreakers weren't, and that still exists. Besides that, I'm actually pretty happy with how itemization is in this game. For the most part, you can craft your own or find rares that are probably going to be your best in slots, but sometimes you build around uniques and they are your best in slots. And there's nothing you can do about that because that's just, I think, good itemization. Maybe you can introduce sets in the future, but I'm not that big a fan of sets, and I don't think they need to exist. Something like rune words could be a thing in the future, but then we'd be even more destroyed on stash space. So speaking of which, buff stash space, give us more. I have 16 tabs and I still want more because of what? I don't know, maps, essences, gems, cards. There's just so much stuff you need to store these days, so yeah, we could use some more stash tab organization or a couple of extra stash tabs for everyone, something like that. I think that's all I want to say about buffing towards the game. Not too much needs to be buffed right now, power creep and all that, but there are a lot of skills out there and some things that have just been left behind while new stuff gets introduced, and I think they do need slight adjustments if GGG wants these skills to be played in the future and competitive rather than just relics of the past. So, hope that wasn't too boring for you and gave you some insight into what I think about the game right now. Thank you very much for watching and see you guys next time.